All right, if you are in early, welcome. We're going to get started here in just a few minutes. My name is Jeremy Tate, one of the founders here, the Classic Learning Test. Looks like we've got about 10 people in the room right now. I'm going to make sure that the chat is functional. So make sure your chat is turned here to all hosts and panelists, or actually everyone. And let us know what part of the country you are dialing in from today, if you would. So CLT is in Annapolis. President Messmore, can you see that okay?
From Olivia to everyone. We're looking at.
Yes, there we go. Right, we got Olivia in Stewartstown, Pennsylvania. Welcome, Olivia. We got Hannah in Texas. Hannah, what part of Texas are you in? Again, if you're just getting in the room, let us know. Oh, we've got Egan from Beaverton, Oregon. Egan, I actually grew up in Beaverton. I would have gone to Sunset High School had we stayed there, but it's a great part of the country. So welcome. We've got Grace Gardner from San Antonio, Texas. Grace, welcome. Thanks for being here. Marty from New Mexico. Wendy from Houston, Texas. Fantastic. Welcome. So this is a very exciting one. It is 7 o'clock right now. We're going to go ahead and get.
Oh, we got New Zealand. All right.
We got New Zealand. What time is it in New Zealand right now? I'm guessing it's.
I don't think we want to know.
Yeah, tomorrow or something crazy. And we've got Argentina as well. Fantastic.
All right.
CLT shot up to about 8% international test takers. So great to have some students internationally here as well. So I will go ahead and kick off here with an introduction to President Messmore. Tell a little story with this. Now, you may be coming into this and you've never heard of CLT before, or maybe even C.S. Lewis. Excited to introduce you, or maybe Magdalen College as well. Excited to introduce you to three things that I think are all wonderful. But first, kind of tell a little bit about Magdalen. So Magdalen College, when CLT launched back in 2015, it was really kind of a crazy idea to challenge the College Board, who is the biggest influencer really in American education. They own AP, SAT, PSAT, and they're really biased in kind of censoring the Catholic intellectual tradition. And if you think about it for just a second here, I mean, we've got a dynamic where the most powerful education company in America is censoring the intellectual tradition that literally gave birth to universities themselves. And so CLT launched with a crazy idea of wanting to kind of go toe-to-toe, pick a fight, if you will, with the College Board and offering a better vision of education and offering tests that reflect that vision and that we're drawing from the very best of what has been thought and said. And, you know, a lot of colleges now adopt CLT because we're a great way to connect with students. Magdalen early on adopted out of mission. They understood that these tests, they don't just show students and indicate what is important. They really do drive curriculum at the secondary level as well. What gets tested ends up getting taught. And so very grateful to Magdalen and very grateful to President Messmore. So President Messmore is in a new role as a new college president, which I think would probably be one of the harder jobs in the country. You do like 30 different things and you've got to do them all very well, but you are a top scholar in addition to that, and a fellow Lewis fanatic. Now, I've got to tell you, Dr. Messmore, President Messmore, the timing of this, it could not be more strange for me. So I was supposed to be sleeping in the kilns tonight in England. I was here with Keith Nix, former president of our board at CLT, and Keith had some friends get stuck in England due to positive COVID tests and said, if you're going to come, you might be staying for a while. And so on Sunday, we canceled the trip. We were going to be staying out there with Ty Rollins, who's a warden at the kilns right now. And I was dreaming about it. You've probably been there, I would imagine. I never have. And we canceled last minute, but
I'm so sorry.
This is a really good substitute though. This is a really good substitute. I had Lewis on my mind this week anyway. So President Messmore, really grateful to have you here tonight. Thank you for your time. Thank you for the love CLT has received from Magdalen College over the years. So with that, I will turn it over to you.
Terrific. Well, right back at you. Thank you, Jeremy, for the way that you partnered with Magdalen, and really appreciate you inviting me here tonight to talk about somebody who's had a lot of influence on me, C.S. Lewis. Had a great impact on my imagination, on my faith, even on my own story. believe it or not, I met my wife through teaching a course on the theology of C.S. Lewis and the Chronicles of Narnia. And then we have 4 children. We named our second son Christopher Samwise, just so he would have a CS in his initials. So this is very dear to my heart. Many people will know kind of the rough contours of his story, so I won't dwell on that too much. But he, born in Belfast, Ireland in 1898, he was given at birth the name Clive Staples. So you can understand why he insisted for the rest of his life on being called Jack. The name of his dog when he was a boy was actually Jaxie. And when his mother died at a young age, he insisted on being called the name of his dog, Jaxie. So that's how Jack came to be. He went to boarding school. He lost his faith. He was an avid atheist. He fought and was wounded in World War I. Most people, though, probably know him as the author of over 30 books and a professor of English literature at Oxford University and professor of medieval and Renaissance literature at Cambridge University. Now, one of the interesting things is that when he taught at both Oxford and Cambridge, the college that he was a member at both of those universities was Magdalen College, although as they pronounce it over there, Magdalen College. So I also feel that certain connection with him as well. He was a member of the Inklings, a little fellowship study group with J.R.R. Tolkien. But he's perhaps best known for his children's book series, The Chronicles of Narnia, which have sold now over 100 million copies. And when I was teaching a course on Narnia, I would ask my students about their favorite book and about their favorite character. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. Can you see that?
Yes.
Excellent. There's a shot of Magdalen College in Oxford, very similar to the architecture, the one in Warner, New Hampshire, but we'll talk about that in a little bit. But when I would ask my Narnia students about their favorite book and their favorite character, the winner tended to always be The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, and the favorite character was Reepicheep, the valiant mouse who was head of the talking mice in Narnia. And for all of Reepicheep's life, his heart's desire was one thing and one thing only: to journey to Aslan's country. When he was a baby mouse in his cradle, a wood woman or a dryad used to speak a certain verse over Reepicheep, which said, "Where sky and water meet, where the waves grow sweet, doubt not, Reepicheep, to find all you seek. There is the utter east." Reepicheep did not know what these words meant, but he says they cast a certain spell on him that stayed with him all of his life. And one of the most well-known quotes from all of the Chronicles of Narnia is delivered by Reepicheep when he is coming to the utter east and about to find, hopefully, all that he seeks. But you may know this quote: "My own plans are made. While I can, I sail east in the Dawn Treader. When she fails me, I paddle east in my coracle. When she sinks, I shall swim east with my 4 paws. And when I can swim no longer, if I have not reached Aslan's country or shot over the edge of the world in some vast cataract, I shall sink with my nose to the sunrise. And Peepaseek will be head of the talking mice in Narnia." One of the reasons I think that the character of Reepicheep and this quote in particular is so significant is that it captures a theme that was central to Lewis's own life and very prevalent in his writings. In his autobiography, Lewis says that he felt a kind of spell come over him when he was a boy. It first happened when he saw the title of the book, Siegfried and the Twilight of the Gods. And at that moment, he says that pure northernness engulfed me. and the longing that rushed upon him felt like returning at last from exile and desert lands to my own country. So Lewis described this sense of northernness as a kind of longing, the same sort of longing that drove Reepicheep in his quest for Aslan's country. So I think Lewis and Reepicheep share something deep in common. So my overarching question for our time tonight is, what was the true end or goal for which Reepicheep was aiming? And what should we make of this sort of longing, and what can we learn from it? Lewis believed that the experience of longing is universal. We all sense it to some degree at some point in time. And by paying special attention to it, we can draw from it conclusions about human beings and about the universe and about theology. So that is one thing that C.S. Lewis seemed to be particularly adept at. And one reason why I think his writings were so popular. He was able to look inside himself and look inside people in general and inside human nature. And he was able to derive profound insights about larger reality, particularly about truth, goodness, and beauty. These are properties of being that are called transcendentals because they transcend any particular thing or place or time period. They are common to all beings. And Lewis believed deeply in these traditional classical properties of being. Realities that are objective, they're really out there, beyond our own human mind and feelings, and not dependent on our human minds and feelings. So when you go as deep as you can into the property of being, and as deep as you can into what can be known, you get to the bedrock properties of truth, goodness, and beauty. And Lewis believed that there are faculties within the human person which point to truth, goodness, and beauty. And that's what I want to focus on tonight. So as a way of exploring some of the thought of C.S. Lewis, I want to look at how he explored three faculties in particular: reason, moral conscience, and the sense of longing. And I want to look at what he was able to draw out of that. And what he drew out of that, spoiler alert, was evidence of a larger truth, a larger goodness, and a larger beauty. And by doing this, we'll get an overview of his thought, and we'll be able to explore some of what I think are his most important works. And I'll suggest some driving questions that Lewis took up in his writings, and some interpretive keys to understanding his thought. So let's dive in with the first thing that Lewis found when he looked inside himself. And that was rational thought. He found himself thinking, which corresponded with a natural desire to know. Lewis agreed with Aristotle that we are rational beings. He wrote, one of the things that distinguishes man from the other animals is that he wants to know things. He wants to find out what reality is like simply for the sake of knowing. When that desire is completely quenched in anyone, I think he has become something less than human. And also in looking inside the human experience, Lewis finds that people not only think, but they think that their thoughts can really be true. And that claims that contradict their thoughts can really be false. So these points about men thinking and thinking that their thoughts about things can actually be true may seem a pretty obvious claim to make. Well, duh, everybody thinks. But Lewis was well aware of a worldview that actually disagreed with that, that held, in fact, that thoughts are merely subjective events in the brain and don't actually apprehend anything else outside the brain. He called this view naturalism. In his book, Miracles, he states, some people believe that nothing exists except nature. And I call these people naturalists. Naturalists hold to a closed universe in which everything that exists can ultimately be explained without remainder by the physical causes that precede it, because that's all that exists is nature. And what by that he means just kind of the collision of atoms in the physical universe. Let's see. So we have the experience of a thought in our head. How do we explain that? Well, the naturalist would claim that thoughts are explained by the collision of atoms in our cranium. And these collisions are ultimately random and not related to the purpose or intention of a being outside of nature, outside of the physical collision of atoms. And our culture today also seems to doubt the existence of truth and our ability as humans to know it. And so this is the first driving question I want to put on the table as we're considering the thought of C.S. Lewis. Can thinking lead to truth? Or are thoughts merely subjective? Now, the problem with answering that they're merely subjective for Lewis is that insofar as that view doesn't believe in the existence of a creator God or a primal reason, a reason independent of humans that our reasoning can actually participate in, because it denies those things, it cannot provide justification for rational thinking, the kind of thinking that actually finds truth. For naturalists, our mental behavior remains merely subjective. Now, according to Lewis, you can only reach that conclusion by failing to pay attention to the act of thinking itself and what that act implies. He says the naturalists have been engaged in thinking about nature. They have not attended to the fact that they were thinking. The moment one attends to this, it is obvious that one's own thinking cannot be merely a natural event, and that therefore something other than nature exists, something other than this completely closed physical system must exist if we can indeed think. So here's what he means. If one's own thinking were merely a natural event, there would be no reason to trust to the random collision of atoms that lead me to believe in naturalism, right? As he said, if my mental processes are determined wholly by the motions of atoms in my brain, I have no reason to suppose that my beliefs are true. And hence, I have no reason for supposing my brain to be composed of atoms. Lewis was brilliant at making this sort of argument, of driving things to their logical conclusion. And so the first interpretive key I want to offer for understanding Lewis's thought is simply the notion of reason with a capital R. He believed firmly in reason, and he believed that it is something more than cerebral biochemistry. It also entails a logical ordering of human thoughts to truth. And here we find that Lewis just loves logic. He was tutored in logic and other subjects by somebody named William Kirkpatrick when he was a teenager, when Lewis was a teenager. William Kirkpatrick was known as the Great Knock, and his instruction in logic to Lewis was significant in the development of Lewis's education. We even find, when you read in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, one of the first characters we meet is called Professor Kirk, very similar to his own tutor, Professor Kirkpatrick. And we find this Professor Kirk at one point in the story crying out in exasperation, "Logic! Why don't they teach logic at these schools anymore?" So that's tied into Lewis's own story there. But in promoting a logical order of thought, Lewis was asserting his belief that our mental behaviors are capable of perceiving something outside of our brains. It is possible for thoughts to exist not merely as subjective thoughts, but to be rational thoughts, to be thoughts about something. If this were not so, argues Lewis, we would have no rational grounds for coming to believe in naturalism in the first place. He says, a theory which made it impossible to believe that our thinking was valid would be utterly out of court, for that theory would itself have been reached by thinking. And if thinking is not valid, that theory would, of course, be itself demolished. It would have destroyed its own credentials. It would be an argument which proved that no argument was sound, a proof that there are no such thing as proofs, which is nonsense. So we find ourselves looking inside. We find ourselves thinking and believing that our thinking leads us to truth. And Lewis makes this move where he says, noticing that very faculty tells us something about the universe. Lewis says that the presence of the desire to know is evidence of an object that really exists to satisfy it. He says, as thirst was made for water, inquiry was made for truth. And this is the first instance of a certain move that we'll see Lewis make in several other areas tonight, arguing that the existence of the faculty proves the existence of the object that satisfies that faculty. Lewis refers to this as the teleological argument, from the Greek word telos, meaning purpose or end or goal. And he describes the teleological argument this way. He says, creatures are not born with desires unless satisfaction for those desires exists. A baby feels hunger. Well, there is such a thing as food. A duckling wants to swim. Well, there is such a thing as water. Men feel sexual desire. Well, there is such a thing as sex. And in the case of thinking, man is able to and desires to engage in rational thought. Well, there's such a thing as truth. And reason is its organ. Reason is the organ of truth. So Lewis looks inside himself. He finds rational thought. What does that point to? An intelligible universe, a reason that is valid, and the fact that there is such a thing as truth, and it can be ascertained by human beings through reason, among other things, the imagination and other things. So not just reason, but let's at least start with reason. Okay, but that's not the only thing that Lewis finds by looking inside himself. In addition to rational thought, Lewis looks deep inside of human nature and he finds a moral conscience. And he also interestingly finds himself using a particular kind of language. In fact, he notices that people everywhere use this kind of language. Language like, that's not fair, and she didn't deserve that, and how do you like it if somebody did that to you? In fact, the very first line of Mere Christianity reads, everyone has heard people quarreling. It's the first line of the book. Why is that so important? Why start such an important book on the Christian faith with everyone quarrels? Well, Lewis notes that people who say these kinds of things, that's not fair, you wouldn't like it if somebody did that to you, are not merely saying that they don't happen to prefer certain behavior. Rather, they are appealing to a kind of standard of behavior that they believe and expect other people to know about. They expect other people to share this standard of right and wrong. And what is quarreling but trying to show that the other person is further away from that standard than you are? But of course, if there wasn't that standard, you wouldn't be able to make that sort of argument. So he calls this a sense of oughtness, that we ought to do some things and ought not to do other things. And this is different from a strong feeling to do something out of instinct. And he gives a whole argument as to why that is. But this sense of oughtness is something above and beyond us. It's a real thing that humans did not invent, but which we nevertheless feel pressing in upon us. And that thing is something like a mind that has intentions and purposes. And it is intensely interested in right conduct. Now, it was partly due to recognizing the standard that Lewis questioned his own atheism. So this was key for bringing him out of atheism into a belief in a God. As an atheist, he argued against God on the basis of evil and suffering in the world. He believed that the universe was cruel and unjust, and therefore there could not exist this sort of God that people talk about. But then he asked himself, how had I got this idea of just and unjust? Where did that come from? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. What standard of right? Or what was I comparing this universe with when I called it unjust? So he had to admit that there was the standard of right that he recognized. And it was only in light of that standard that he could meaningfully use words like evil and unjust in the first place. So once again, we look inside of human nature. We find the sense of oughtness bearing down. We all try to make excuses when we violate that sense of oughtness. And this leads Lewis to conclude that there is more than one kind of reality. In addition to physical reality and logical reality, as we just talked about, there is a moral reality. There is a moral order to the universe that's really there, independent of what we think about it. And so this is brings us to our second driving question. We've already asked, can thinking lead to truth? The second driving question I want to put on the table for understanding Lewis's thought is, can we argue value judgments as facts, or are they merely opinions? Is there an objective moral order that we can argue as we do facts? Or do we just have to say, your values are yours, mine are mine? And we'll have to leave it at that. Today, the idea that there is such a thing as a moral order is a very unpopular position to hold, as you well know. People are afraid to make value judgments about other people, afraid to make value judgments about other ways of life, afraid to make value judgments about other kinds of family formation, afraid to make value judgments about all sorts of things. Consider a scenario of a typical college classroom where a freshman makes a comment about her favorite saint, saying, well, Maximilian Kolbe was a good person who gave his life in place of, and then the student's cut off by the professor, who says, what you just stated is an opinion. And while you are entitled to your opinion, it is merely the expression of an emotion that you have toward this person. And please do not assert it as a fact. It being that Maximilian Kolbe was a good person. Or consider another example. A young man raises his hand during a literature class on the Lord of the Rings and says, Tom Bombadil and his wife Goldberry have a good marriage. They display perfect unity and they offer hospitality to the hobbits. But again, the professor interjects and says, well, you may happen to have a personal preference for that kind of family structure, but you can't assume that everybody else in the class prefers the same. Even if the student were to respond, I'm not just saying that I prefer marriage, I'm making an argument. I'm offering reasons why I think this marriage is in fact good. The professor would still insist, you can't argue that a personal taste should be acknowledged by others. Just as you can't argue that others should like mint chocolate chip just because you happen to like it. So this is what the average college student faces today in America. And just like Lewis encountered and critiqued naturalism in The Abolition of Man and The Poison of Subjectivism and other places, he argued against this sort of moral relativism. And he argued for the objectivity of basic moral precepts. That reality is the kind of thing that merits certain attitudes of judgment toward it. And therefore our judgments can, in fact, be wrong. So here again, we turn to a very important notion for Lewis. The question is, can value judgments such as this is good, this is a good person, this is a good marriage, be argued as facts, or are they simply expressions of personal preference? Is marriage like mint chocolate chip? And if you wanted to argue no, how would you go about doing it? Well, this is where the second interpretive key comes in really handy today in a college classroom. The first interpretive key was reason. The second interpretive key for understanding Lewis is telos, as we've already mentioned, meaning purpose. And this, he returns to this over and over and over again in his writings. I want to try something with you and just ask you to think about this in your own head. If I were to ask you what you know this thing to be, what would you say? Most of you, I think, pretty quickly would say, well, that's a cup. And if I said, well, why did you call it a cup? You would probably say, well, it holds water and I can drink from it. Okay. So now the question is, if I asked you, what is this thing that I found in my hotel room? What would you say? I think most of you would probably say, it's an ice bucket. To which I would respond to you, but it holds water and I could also drink from it, right? So why is this not a cup? And then you would correctly answer, because that's not its purpose. That's not what it was intended to do. So see, we know things according to their purpose. Now, if I were to take a piece of fabric hanging on the window next to me and show it to you and ask you, what do you know that as? Most of you would say, oh, that's a curtain. If I took that exact same piece of fabric off the window and turned and put it on my bed, what would you know it as? Many of you would probably say a comforter or a quilt. Which brings up an interesting story that happened to me when I was in college. I was up late really one night writing a paper, and I was so tired I accidentally hit the Q on my keyboard instead of a G. And I turned in a paper the next morning that said, Jesus came to take away our quilt. And so my professor circled that in the margin, wrote, yes, but he did promise to leave behind a comforter. So the purpose there is that even the same thing can be known differently when it is used for different purposes. So when we come to this question, is this good? We have to ask a prior question, which is, well, what is this? And as we just learned, the way to answer that question is to ask about its purpose, its telos. Once we know that, then we have a standard by which we can judge something good or bad, insofar as it achieves the purpose for which it was created. So if we know the purpose of a human being, we can make an argument about whether this particular one is a good one. If we know the telos, or the purpose for which marriage was created, we can then judge whether this particular one is a good one or not. Alistair McIntyre says that to know something is good is to know it is good according to its purpose. And Lewis argued in the same way. Therefore, we can make arguments about the good as facts. We can offer reason for them, just like we would argue for any other facts. So we look inside ourselves, we find a moral conscience. What does that point to? For Lewis, it points to a moral universe, and it points to such a thing as objective goodness. sort of goodness that doesn't just depend on what we happen to think of it. But that's not all. Lewis looked inside himself and found, in addition to finding rational thought, which leads to reason and truth, and in addition to finding a moral conscience, which leads to a moral universe and goodness, Lewis looked inside himself and found an inconsolable longing. And this will end up pointing to not just a rational universe, not just a moral universe, but a beautiful universe of personal communion. And I want to suggest one additional interpretive key for understanding Lewis's thought, and that is desire, or what Lewis called joy. This was extremely important to him. And I think when Lewis is writing about longing, he is at his most profound and his most beautiful writing when he's talking about this. But under that interpretive key, I want to suggest two sub-keys for understanding what Lewis meant by desire or joy. And that is the theme of home and the theme of dance. So let's unpack this sort of longing. Lewis says it's a very particular kind of longing. On the one hand, it is a sort of nostalgia, which feels like a kind of remembering. But on the other hand, it is a remembering of something we haven't yet experienced. And this leads us to the driving question for this section. What will satisfy our deepest longing? Is there an objective, attainable source to satisfy the desire that we have and that we don't seem to be able to quench? Lewis answers yes and no to that question. Our deepest longing is a longing that he says will never be fulfilled in our earthly existence. And that's why he calls it inconsolable. But he says it is an unsatisfied desire, which is itself more desirable than any other satisfaction, which is just fascinating to think about, right? He describes it as the scent of a flower we haven't found, the echo of a tune we have not heard, news from a country we have never yet visited. This is the sort of longing that came to him when he saw the title of that book, Siegfried and the Twilight of the Gods. We also see it in the character of Shasta in The Horse and His Boy. At the very beginning of that book, Shasta looks to the north, looks out of his window and sees this green hill, and he's never gotten beyond it. He doesn't know what lies on the other side, but he says that he was very interested in everything that lay to the north, and that he's been longing to go to the north all his life. That northernness for Shasta represented a desire to find one's true home. And that's the first sub-key of this desire. It's a desire for a place of identity where we are known, a place of belonging, where we are loved and welcomed. And thus it's a desire for a true home. But in an interesting move, Lewis calls this longing beauty. Even though it's something that nothing can quench, he says that it's beauty or joy. And even though we can't quench it right now in this earthly life, we long to have that feeling of longing again. So it's a longing for a certain kind of longing, a desire for that desire to pop up again. But it's a beauty and a joy with a very special quality. Listen to this quote very carefully. He says, "We do not merely want to see beauty. We want something else which can hardly be put into words, to be united with the beauty we see, to pass into it, to receive it into ourselves, to bathe in it to become part of it. That's huge. And this is where he borrows the word dance. For a dance is a beautiful, harmonious experience that we can enter into and become part of and participate in. And so Lewis thinks all of us want to be swept up into this great cosmic dance, but which won't happen until we get to heaven. And what do we find when we get to heaven? We find that we will be welcomed to the inside of things finally. He says this inconsolable longing suggests that we will one day be welcomed, received, recognized, and appreciated or delighted in by God. We will be invited to the inside of things. So in other words, the object of our longing, our true home, is life in personal communion with God. These are very personal words that Lewis uses to describe heaven: welcoming, receiving, recognition, appreciation, delight. It's inundated with personal communion. And for Lewis, this is the life of the Trinity. Now, Lewis is not known as a Trinitarian theologian. When you mention his name, that's not the first thing you think of. But he is known for thoughts and quotes about love. He did see deeply into the nature of love. And love, I would submit, is the very nature of the triune God. The Trinity only makes sense, or the Trinity makes sense of the biblical claim that God is love. And I think only the Trinity can make sense of a claim like that. But even though Lewis isn't known for that, I do want to point out a couple places where he does kind of tip his hat explicitly to the triune nature of God. When Shasta, in The Horse and His Boy, is traveling north, he encounters a lion. And later he says, who are you? To this lion. It's nighttime, he can't see, but he can hear a voice. He says to that voice, who are you? And with a kind of echo of Yahweh answering that same question of Moses by saying, I am, the lion answers, myself, very deep and low so that the earth shook. And again, myself, loud and clear and gay. And then the third time, myself, whispered so softly, you could hardly hear it. And yet it seemed to come from all around you as if the leaves rustled with it. So myself, 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 earth shaking, human breath or wind. It's the Trinity, right? I noted earlier how dance was an image that Lewis uses to characterize the object of our learning. It is also the image he uses to characterize the Trinity in his most explicit writing on the Trinity in Mere Christianity. He says, he's talking about the claim God is love, and he writes, the loving dynamic activity of love has been going on in God forever. God is a dynamic, pulsating activity, a life, almost a kind of drama, almost, if you will not think me irreverent, a kind of dance. The union between the Father and the Son is such a live, concrete thing that the union itself is also a person. It is as if a sort of communal personality came into existence and invited us into his great dance. One of the most beautiful places where Lewis just lets his imagination run wild with this is the book, The Great Divorce, one of my favorite books of all time. There's a character in that book who does make it into that sort of loving relationship with God, with others, with the rest of creation. She lives in perfect harmony with everything. And her name is Sarah Smith. And there's one line in the book where the other characters say of her, the happy Trinity is her home. The happy Trinity is her home. So there again, that theme of home and dance, they become one for Lewis, and they both find their source in the Trinity, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. So Lewis looks inside, and he finds longing, desire, urge for joy. And what does that reveal? For Lewis, it reveals a beautiful universe. There is such a thing as beauty, the end or telos of our longing, which brings us all the way back to Rinpoche. You'll remember that he lived his entire life with this enchantment or the spell of finding everything that he seeks in the utter East. What was his true end? What was he ultimately seeking? What should we make of his sort of longing, and what can we learn from it? As Lewis often does, he has a passage in one of the Chronicles of Narnia be explained almost word for word in a chapter in Mere Christianity. So in Mere Christianity, after using that teleological argument that creatures are not born with desires unless satisfaction for those desires exists, Lewis says this: if I find in myself a desire which no experience in this world can satisfy, and Rinpoche was not able to find anything in the world that satisfied it, the most probable explanation is that I was made for another world. If none of my earthly pleasures satisfy it, that does not prove that the universe is a fraud. Probably earthly pleasures were never meant to satisfy it, but only to arouse it, to point to it, to suggest the real thing. If that is so, I must take care, on the one hand, never to despise or to be unthankful for these earthly blessings. And on the other, never to mistake them for the something else of which they are only a kind of copy or echo or mirage. He then says, and just hear Rinpoche in the background, I must keep alive in myself the desire for my true country, which I shall not find till after death. I must never let it get snowed under or turned aside. I must make it the main object of life to press on to that other country and to help others do the same. That's Rinpoche. His main object of life was pressing on to Azon's country. And we find out later, spoiler alert, for those of you who haven't read The Last Battle, he makes it. And he experiences what Jewel the Unicorn experiences upon entering that same country. I have come home at last. This is my real country. This is where I belong. This is the land I have been looking for all my life, though I never knew it till now. I've been trying to find the source of my longing and satisfaction in fame and in boyfriends and in good grades and in money and in alcohol and in sex. And I never knew until now, this is what I've been waiting for: entrance into Aslan's country. Come further up, come further in. So where is Rinpoche heading? He's heading home to the loving communion of the Trinity, in whose life he can actively enter into and participate in from the inside. But just one more thing about that quote. I don't want you to miss it. Lewis doesn't end that very powerful quote with simply pressing on to that other country, period, full stop. He actually ends with, and to help others do the same. Remember, this is love that Lewis thinks that we're participating in. We need to extend that to the people who are around us and help them journey to their true country. In The Weight of Glory, Lewis reminds us that there are no ordinary people. Everyone we encounter may one day be a creature which, if you saw it now, you would be strongly tempted to worship, or a horror and a corruption, such as if you meet it now, only you do so only in a nightmare. All day long, we are, in some degree, helping each other to one or the other of these destinations, right? Every day, you and I are helping each other to become either the sort of creature that in the presence of God, we would be tempted to worship, or the most perverted corruption we've ever imagined. And so we should not just for ourselves press on toward that other country. We should help others to do the same. We should encounter them with love. So I put before us 3 driving questions tonight. Is reason valid? Is morality objective? Can we reach the source of beauty, the object of our desire? And I've tried to show that Lewis is a modern day champion of what those faculties within us can point to, of truth, of goodness, and of beauty. But these properties of being are not just vague ideas. They're not just abstract or ethereal. When we said that there's an external standard, which is the source of that sense of oughtness that presses on us, it's the source of beauty, it's the source of the world's intelligibility, it's the source of that telos that allows us to make value judgments. That external standard is not just kind of an idea floating in the clouds up there somewhere. It's concrete for Lewis. It's a concrete communion of persons in which we can participate. So those triune relations of love, they are the very order of truth, goodness, and beauty. And this is what separates Christians from and the God they worship from just the God of the philosophers. For Lewis, it's all about coming home to the personal, loving, welcome communion of the triune God. This is what we're made for, and we're restless until our homecoming is consummated. Jeremy, can I borrow 3 more minutes?
Absolutely. Yeah.
All right. I want to give you a bonus driving question for understanding the thought of Lewis, and that is why believe in Christianity rather than the alternatives? Now, we could spend a whole lot of time on that. I just want to draw out one particular alternative, which is the alternative of scientific cosmology or scientism, that sort of naturalism that I referred to earlier. And along with this bonus question and answering it, I want to give you one more interpretive key, which is fittingness. What do I mean by fittingness? Well, Lewis argued that the worldview that we should adhere to is the one that offers the most comprehensive explanation of reality in all its dimensions. So Lewis thought that the philosophy that we should judge true and worthy of our trust is one that you can fit in all of the facts of life. That what we should judge most real is that explanation that can fit in all aspects of life as we encounter it. And this is where he thinks that scientism fails. Scientism can't fit in our natural desire to know and our sense that rational thought can find truth. It can't make sense of our moral conscience. Scientism can't fit in our longing for beauty. And interestingly, scientism can't even make sense of science itself. Lewis says, if minds are wholly dependent on brains, and brains on biochemistry, and biochemistry in the long run on the meaningless flux of the atoms, I cannot understand how the thought of those minds should have any more significance than the sound of the wind in the trees. But what can explain all of these things is belief in the triune God, who is the very essence, order, and source of truth, goodness, and beauty. So I want to read you a long quote, but this is the quote we're going to end on, and just sit back and close your eyes and enjoy this. It doesn't get much better than this. So Lewis is writing in his essay is theology poetry. He's trying to answer the question, why do I prefer Christianity to scientism? He says, and this to me is the final test. This is how I distinguish, in fact, dreaming and waking. When I am awake, I can, in some degree, account for and study my dream. I can fit the dream in. The dragon that pursued me last night can be fitted into my waking world. I know that there are such things as dreams. I know that I had eaten an indigestible dinner. I know that a man of my reading might be expected to dream of dragons. But while in the nightmare, I could not have fitted in my waking experience. The waking world is judged more real because it can thus contain the dreaming world. The dreaming world is judged less real because it cannot contain the waking one. For the same reason, I am certain that in passing from the scientific point of view, scientism, to the theological, I have passed from dream to waking. Christian theology can fit in science, art, morality, and even the sub-Christian religions. The scientific point of view cannot fit in any of these things, not even science itself. And then I'm going to venture a guess that you know, or you at least heard before, the very next line. This is where Lewis says, I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun has risen. Not only because I see it, but because by it, I see everything else. Christianity fits in everything else. On the 50th anniversary of Lewis's death, about 7 or 8 years ago, he was honored with a memorial stone in Westminster Abbey. It was placed in Poets' Corner alongside renowned literary figures like Chaucer and Dickens. And one single quote from Lewis could appear on that marker. And guess which one it was? It was that one. So I think that's a pretty good place to end. Thank you.
Wow, President Messmore, fantastic job. Thank you so much. My first question, and we'll open it up for questions for just a couple of minutes here from students, is if you go to Magdalen, you get to have you as a professor, because that was fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, and the course I'm teaching is a course on the Trinity. It's called the Trinity, Love, and the Good Life. Are there any 3 better things to spend your time pursuing in college? Reap Cheap would say no. So.
Awesome. Thank you. Well, very good. Well, let's do this. We'll wait for a question or 2 to come in from students, but let us know as well. The student is interested in Magdalen. What is a good next step? Are there summer opportunities? Are you taking applications now? What is a kind of a good step to get to know Magdalen a bit more as well?
Yeah, we are accepting applications, and if you get your applications in, I think by early February, then you will be eligible to be selected to come to campus. We will pay for it, all expense paid, to our campus for a scholarship weekend where you can compete for all sorts of financial aid. So that's one opportunity to come find out what we're about on our dime. There's also a fascinating opportunity this summer to come to Magdalen and to get a real taste of life at Magdalen and the kind of learning that we promote. We have 2 kinds of summer programs. Each of them are 2 weeks. One of them, you get to take a course in each of our majors. So history, literature, philosophy, theology. You get to experience being in the choir and to sing for liturgy. You get to do everything we do at Magdalen. It's kind of a broad exposure. There's another 2-week opportunity where you can pick one course and you can dive deep into that course and you can get a college credit for it. So it's up to you as to which one you want. You get to experience all of the other aspects of social life at Magdalen for that other course as well. So go to our website. At the bottom of the website, you'll see a yellow banner. You can click on that banner and it'll take you to more info about our summer programs. Magdalen.edu is the website.
Fantastic. I've been up to campus, beautiful part of the country for sure. I'm not seeing questions coming in from students right now, but students do get up there and visit. And again, it sounds like early February is a good time to get the applications in by in order to be eligible for some scholarship competitions. President Messmore, students, thank you. This will be up on our YouTube page as well, so you can share it with friends there. Yeah, thank you all and have a really wonderful night.
Thank you, Jeremy. Thanks everyone for tuning in.
Thank you.
I'm so glad you have that quote in your room, Olivia. Well done.
And President Messmore, is there still some students in the room? I did notice one question come in here, and that is asking, do you think Lewis began to wonder if thought could really reach the truth through thought after his reconversion to Christianity? Professor Kirkpatrick was an atheist, but it was largely from what Lewis learned under his tutelage that he came up with lots of his ideas. I'm not sure if you can see that question or not.
No, I can't, but one thing that I was hoping we could tease from this presentation was just how significant the objectivity of truth, goodness, and beauty is for Lewis. They are real things that exist independent of humans. We did not create them, we discover them. And so that the ability for Lewis's faith, his Christian faith, to ground a conviction in the objectivity of those things, I would say certainly helped. There's plenty of epistemological realists, which is the technical term for it, who believe that our thoughts actually can make contact with reality, who are not Christian. So I don't think it's a necessary condition for holding that. But as Lewis begins to ask these questions, as he begins to think, you know what, if I'm going to argue at all, I have to take certain things as presuppositions. I have to take reason as presupposition. I have to take the objectivity of moral values as givens, as self-evident. I can't critique these things and argue against them. I use them to argue about everything else and to think about everything else. So I think his the more he came in to the Christian faith, the more solid grounding he had for believing that his realism was in fact real.
Is there you mentioned the Great Divorce? Is that, would you say the number one Lewis text for you to kind of go back to time and time again?
I do. I never thought anything would surpass Narnia, just because I taught it forever and I've read it so many times. I met my wife through it. But when I began to be interested in the Trinity and then reread The Great Divorce through a Trinitarian lens, I think what Lewis is doing there is he's presenting an ontology of love, which is a crazy thing to think about. We think in modern Western thought, we tend to think that what's most primary, what has the most foundational existence are nouns, people who then have relationships, and the relationships are kind of secondary. Biblical thought is the other way around. What has priority are the relationships. And then at the end of those relationships are people who have them. And so you kind of think to yourself, what would it mean to tell a story about a world in which love, the activity of love, was the most real thing there is, and everything else was a shadow. Everything else was kind of a so Lewis writes The Great Divorce, and he has people walk through this land, and the grass is so real that it hurts their feet, and the apples are so heavy that they can barely pick them up. We are the ghosts. We are the unsubstantial beings. And it turns out that what is the most substantial reality is love. And it's just brilliant. It's miraculous. And it's very short. So I would encourage everybody to go and read it. Or come to Magdalen and we'll get to read it together. I'm assigning in my Trinity course.
I want to hear a bit more about Magdalen in a minute, but I'd love a minute or two answer kind of your thoughts on this. So my favorite course in seminary, I went to a Reformed seminary before reading my way into Catholicism. My favorite course was an elective on Lewis. And so I heard that perspective on why Lewis never became Catholic. And we talked a lot about his relationship with the Catholic Church. Your thoughts on that? I've noticed even in you go to the National Shrine in DC, the Basilica, he's the one non-Catholic author that's like being promoted, which I love. It's fantastic. What are your thoughts on his relationship with the Catholic Church and why he never came in?
Yeah. Well, the first thing to say is that a lot of Protestants are surprised at how many Catholic positions he seems to hold. I mean, he argued for purgatory in The Weight of Glory, the essay, one of the essays I was quoting from. He says, he describes people as becoming almost these things that you're tempted to worship. In the line before that, he says, the most blessed reality ever brought before you is the Blessed Sacrament. Next to that, people. And so you just see his appreciation.
Very Catholic, yeah.
For the Blessed Sacrament. But here's a fascinating answer to your question. There was a gentleman who began thinking seriously about faith by reading Lewis. He then, like you, read himself into the Catholic Church. And so he wrote Lewis. And he said, I find this very odd that you're the one that has shaped all the questions that I've asked and the way in which I think, and yet you're the only one in my realm of people that I turn to now who's not Catholic. Why not? And so Lewis kind of wrote back and he gave a couple answers. He said things like, I don't find, he said, I think you have to use scripture to interpret scripture. And I don't find the things that Catholics claim about Mary and the Pope and praying to the saints and things like this in scripture. And then the guy that wrote the letter wrote Lewis back and he said, with all due respect, I can't believe you're making these arguments because you know darn well that scripture can interpret itself. And he talks about needing a sheet of music to decide which instinct to play at a certain moment. You need some sort of authority. And Christ even says he would give us that authority to be able to interpret the different ways of reading there are. And in fact, there is nothing contradictory about the things the Catholic Church says about Mary. So he writes this letter to Lewis and just kind of ends by saying, wow, okay, I'm not as concerned now about entering the Catholic Church if this is the best reasons that we can come up against it. And so he found himself to be pretty disappointed. Yes, you're right. It's H. Lyman Stebbins wrote the letter, and you can look that up and read it. It's pretty fascinating. Thank you for that comment in the chat. Just found Lewis to not have very good reasons for not being Catholic.
Maybe just his upbringing, perhaps, was that an influence as well, and the weight of that and the way it kind of impacts your, I guess, disposition towards the church. And interesting. So tell us a bit about Magdalen, because I think there are probably people in the room still who maybe have never heard of Magdalen College before. They don't know the first thing about it. Wonder if you could just tell us a couple minutes about it and what students might expect if they come out to visit.
Sure. Yeah. Imagine on your way to Mordor to fight the evil creatures that lie ahead in your work life and in our culture today. Imagine you could stop off and study the liberal arts at Rivendell for 4 years. That's Magdalen College.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Wow.
Magdalen is located in Warner, New Hampshire. It's on the side of a mountain overlooking the hills of New England. It's a place of deep fellowship, academic fellowship, spiritual fellowship, social fellowship, fellowship that is formative for the world that lies ahead and what you'll face in it. We focus on the liberal arts and only the liberal arts in terms of our education. We don't offer different majors that'll help you go off and get jobs in nursing or engineering or something like that. What we offer is, I think, probably the best humanities course in the country, taught by Tony Esselin who writes for the Magnificat and the Catholic Thing, and translated Dante.
It's amazing. I mean, out of Ashes, I read twice and had a profound impact on me as a Catholic. He's been at Magdalen now for 3 or 4 years. Is that right?
That's right.
We need to do another one of these with Dr. Eslan as well. Absolutely incredible teacher, as you are. What is the course that he teaches there?
Well, he's part of the humanities program, which I'll explain a little bit now. But then he also he's just a lover of language, and so he's teaching an elective right now, kind of on the history of language, the history of the English language. And boy, you get him started, and the etymology and the meaning of it. And he, we were doing a podcast a couple of days ago on his book on the Gospel of John. And he was like, yeah, when I was reading in Welsh, which was a pet hobby of mine. I'm like, of course, of course you were reading the Gospel in Welsh. So he's just an amazing intellect. And he's helped put together this humanities course that borrows kind of the best from a lot of different models. The primary mode of teaching at Magdalen College is the Socratic seminar. Primary texts are our main sources. We don't use very many textbooks. But we also borrow from John Senior's model at the University of Kansas back in the day, where you would have several professors talking to each other in front of the students, so the students could hear them in dialogue. To hear Anthony Eslan in dialogue with a philosophy teacher, a history professor, it was just an amazing thing there. And another unique thing about our curriculum is that music is a core course all 4 years. So every student who goes to Magdalen is in the choir. I think we're the only college who can say that. And you don't have to be able to sing. People come in, they're tone deaf, but they are formed into this beautiful uniting chorus of harmony. And you get to the Holy Week liturgies, and it's just enchanting. And when they sing the Alleluia chorus on Easter, oh my goodness, they can't wait until they get to do it again the next year. Now I can tell you, I went through college and I never even thought that was formative for education. But those who truly take classical education seriously and the liberal arts tradition seriously know that music is at the core of shaping you and shaping your brain to think well and to make connections with other subjects and to be in tune with beauty, this objective reality that Lewis so appreciated. So we have beautiful liturgy, we have daily mass, confession, adoration. We have the humanities, we have majors in history, literature, theology, philosophy. And we're a family. People ask me, we're very small. We're under 100 students. And if you're looking for a football team, if you're looking for parties on all sorts of diverse majors, that's not Magdalen. Magdalen is for a person who wants to join a fellowship, to join a family that reads books together and takes walks in the woods, in the snow, and contemplates the deepest questions of life. And people ask me, how big do you want it to be? And I say, well, we want to grow, but we never want it to be larger than what would allow the president to have dinner with all of the students every 2 weeks. And that's what we do. We have the students over to our house once a fortnight, and my wife cooks a big meal, and we ask a big question, and we dive in, and it's just wonderful.
That's awesome. Love this. Well, I will go ahead and end this. Could pick your brain about all kinds of things forever. It was a fun night when I again thought I would be at the Kilns for the first time and seeing.
So sorry about that.
Yeah,
you gotta get over there.
This was a treat. Students, we'll see you next week. Thanks so much for being on. President Messmore again, and students, do check out Magdalen College. It is an absolute gem of a college up there in New England. Thank you, President.
Blessings. Thank you so much.
All right.